Surprise, everybody. This is, as I'm sure you will have noticed, a bonus podcast episode. It's a one-off, and it's come about because of the recent US election result and various people asking me to say something about that. Quite often over the past 10 years or so, whenever there's some really big political event somewhere or other, usually Britain or America, someone will give me a dig and say, you need to write something or say something about this. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And this time it seemed appropriate. So if you're a regular follower of ours, this might have caught you by surprise. But we're also hoping that maybe you're watching for the first time and you don't follow the regular podcasts, but now you will start.
Yeah, that being said, we want to introduce this formally as a foggy day on Olympus, where we are exploring topics of history, religion, and culture, and of course, making a cheeky reference to the Greek gods on Mount Olympus, where they would have lived, and their ability to pass judgment on mankind from far above the everyday life of man, which is what we're attempting to do. And of course, always trying. So my name is Coel Campo.
And I'm Mike Pierce, because I always forget to say that.
And for this particular episode, we're excited to have my very own dear husband to join us because he is far more versed in politics than I am. And so we thought he might have a good opinion to share with us.
Hi, everyone.
But Mike, this is, of course, like you said, we could put out the disclaimer that this is mostly your opinions, right? And then Brian and I will sort of jump in and tell you how wrong you are, as I'm quick to do it. Anyway,
this is basically the plan, yes. But I should say at the outset that we are not even going to be referring to, let alone making arguments about, all the usual claims made on either side of the contest that has just ended. All the Democrat talking points about how dreadful Trump is, or the usual Republican talking points about what a dangerous leftist Kamalaharris is and timwalz. Actually, if anything, I think I would go along with pretty much all of the charge sheets listed by both sides against the other side as being pretty much correct. The problem here was, what was there positive to vote for in favour of something rather than out of terror of the other thing? But we're not going to be diving into that. I sound sometimes like I'm reading here. The reason for that is that I'm reading. What this piece is about is trying to get behind all of this and ask, how did we get here? And when I say we, although this discussion is overwhelmingly about America and the just finished presidential election, the kind of phenomena that we see are also present in different forms from place to place in almost every major Western country. And what we're digging after is, how on earth did we get here? Because unfortunately, we sometimes, due to what gets called political correctness and so on, we find ourselves practically unable even to identify our problems. And that does make it kind of hard to resolve them and address them. So that's what we're going after here.
just to clarify, this is a Mike Pierce original piece, hot off the press. So
yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, 48 hours ago, none of this existed. It was a happier world then. As we've got into a groove with the regular episodes of the podcast of giving ourselves clickbaity titles, so we've done it here. The Revenge of the Childless Cat Ladies, postponed, perhaps indefinitely. All right, here we go. And Coel and Brian will butt in whenever they get completely fed up. And it will also give you who are listening and watching this a bit of a break, because, even Brian is a little bit nicer to look at than I am, and Coel is a completely different story. Right, okay. Democracy is a dangerous thing. For much of my life, quietly and secretly, I have been less than fully persuaded by it. people are stupid. Yes, even those on your side, whatever ridiculous assemblage of fatuous half-truths that might consist of.
Already, I think we may have offended quite a few people, so.
This is, this is the plan, yes. It's always the
Yes.
plan. Yeah, right. Even many liberals back in the 19th century were wary about giving the vote to literally everybody. The poor, it was reasoned, would make unwise choices, being both too uneducated and too desperate. They could not be trusted to vote in ways that would make for stability and their own safety.
Historically, isn't this why women weren't allowed to vote, though? And for a while, it's not necessarily untrue, since women didn't receive a classical education. You know, they're not educated enough to make decisions.
Right. I mean, I tend to think that that was really simply a power play. I'm not sure this line of argument was the power play that we've since told ourselves that it was. But in respect of women, I think that it mostly was. Although there was this strong male discourse to say, this is not, we shouldn't trouble the women's heads with this stuff, and that's kind of contemptible. But yeah, that's not to say that entire consideration in respect of, say, the poor generally was ridiculous. Of course, we've long since judged this was a self-serving argument made by the comfortably off to ensure that power rested and remained in the hands of the propertied. The fact that all people are of equal value, so we've been brought up to believe, means that people should have the same rights, in this case, the franchise. Though the premise be true, it is highly questionable, or so I would contend, whether the conclusion truly follows. In the end, though, the transition to full-on universal suffrage was made, but it was feasible only against a background of steadily rising prosperity, such that even the poorest and least educated could see that tomorrow would, on the whole, be better than today, and that disrupting that flow by electing demagogues of any sort would therefore be unwise. For a while then, it seemed that the doubts of 19th century liberals and antediluvian outliers such as yours truly were wrong. Democracy was not merely right, but safe. It was, to cite another fallacious concept, on the right side of history. But how if the flow of economic goodies were disrupted? In the 1920s and 1930s, almost all Western economies experienced severe and prolonged reverses, spawning savage levels of unemployment, and the rise of communist and fascist movements was the result. Roosevelt's New Deal, whatever one thinks of its merits or demerits, is best understood as a plan to save democracy by rescuing Depression-era Americans from having to choose between freedom and economic security.
Yeah, just to jump in on Roosevelt's New Deal,
Right.
which I'm not extremely well versed in, but it seems to me like it was something that was necessary to help with the depression, right? And so
Yeah.
is that entirely it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. Well, that was what its promoters intended, certainly. Very hard-boiled, ultra-free marketeers in much more recent times, but also at the time, said, no, actually, this is making things worse. I think, on balance, it did ease things, yes. I can see the critique of it, but I think that probably on balance, that understanding is the right one. What he was doing, he was carrying out the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, whose idea was we need to save capitalism from itself. He wanted to save capitalism because he was afraid it would go under one of these fine days with some real big dipper of a recession. And of course, that's exactly what did happen in the 1930s. And that's when the Roosevelt government took on his plan.
I think to piggyback off of what Coel said, there's definitely short-term economic impacts from doing projects like that, but I think long term it's not great for the economy. And I think that's what a lot of people, like you were saying today, would say about it. It's like a lot of these projects, especially from the New Deal, like they didn't really do anything or really go anywhere. It employed people in the short run and gave them money and things to do, but it didn't actually like build anything necessarily. And
Well, there are a lot of big projects like the Dam at Tennessee River Valley project and stuff like that, and infrastructure put in. I think that what you said at first is right, that it's fine as a short term measure, but it can never be a long term policy, because the fallacy the fallacy that you can use it in the long term was shown by the British after World War II, that Keynesianism was the policy of British governments from 1945 really until Thatcher in 1979, and it did Britain no end of harm. Right? If the crisis is real, then it helps. But if you try and make it like a long-term medicine, it's just going to make you sick.
Mhm.
That would be my take on this. Anyway, let's move along here. So the danger in that time was that people would go to extremism, as in many European countries they visibly did. And you get these kind of outliers also in America, like Huey Long down in Louisiana. He had a much bigger following than just Louisiana, right? There's the danger of things going the same kind of way. I mean, he actually looked like a serious challenger for Roosevelt at one point. Okay, so in the same way, it wasn't the support of Ford Motor Company or Standard Oil or the Rand Corporation or the rich more generally that underpinned the persistence of segregation in the American South. It was the extreme poverty of what their betters called white trash. As Gene Hackman's character, FBI agent Rupert Anderson in the movie Mississippi Burning, if you've seen that, recalled his father saying, "If you're not better than a N-word, boy, who are you better than?" It was only once the advent of air conditioning after World War II had transformed productivity in the South, and therefore its economy, and produced the New South, generating a rising tide that lifts all boats, that enough of those southern poor whites were persuadable to let segregation lapse. And as we know, even then, it was a real struggle. Our 19th century forebears were right. Desperate people will not vote for humane politics. Only people who feel that the future will be better, or at least no worse than the present, will do that. Absent the prospect of perpetual goodies, and it's our atavistic tendencies that will drive, or rather cloud, our political judgments.
You're not saying here that if someone isn't buying into the prosperity myth that they shouldn't be voting.
No, I mean, so much water has flowed under the bridge since we introduced universal suffrage. I think it would be absolutely impossible to backpedal on that one now, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always a good idea. It works under the conditions I've just outlined, where prosperity is rising. Nearly everybody, it's too much to ask for it to be everybody, feels that their essential living interests are guaranteed regardless of who's elected, right? And that the future will certainly be no worse than today and probably better. And then even those people at the bottom are not likely to vote for demagogues in enough numbers that you're going to have serious social and political and economic upheaval. Right? But once that all starts to come unstuck, and all of our experiences in modern times, not just in America, but everywhere else in democratic societies as well, shows that then you start to hit real political rough water. So our present economic difficulties, of course, pale in comparison to the dark chapters we've just mentioned. But the advent of the digital revolution has nevertheless decisively and irreversibly upended the kinds of economies that existed in Western countries up to, say, the 1990s. It has handsomely rewarded computer engineers and those who work in or own the new means of production, and it's still obliterating the careers of those who don't. 0 hours contracts and an explosion in pitifully paid service jobs are the obverse side of the coin to the implosion of industry and bank branches and secretaries and soon, of course, commercial driving.
The people who are afraid that they'll be automated out of their jobs, this is a legitimate fear.
Right. And it's not simply the same as the constant flow of technological improvements that have happened during the industrial age. There's always improvements, and okay, it makes people redundant, but they find better jobs elsewhere, and there's other stuff going on. This isn't like that. This is across the board. This is as big as the Industrial Revolution itself. That is, it is making previously valuable skills totally redundant, wholesale. The best book I would recommend on this is Fry's book, The Technology Trap, which we are showing on the slide here in the PowerPoint, which is a great study of that and how it works and what the effects are and are likely to be for the future. Okay, so this talk really is coming in 4 sections, and we've just had one of them, right? That's just an introduction. We're now going to look at the kind of pathologies that have generated on the right in recent years. Then we're going to do the same for the left, and then we're going to try and draw some conclusions. So, on the one hand, we're going to look at the insurgent right and the nouveau pour. Back in 2016, Hillary Clinton unwisely referred to Trump's core supporters, who are overwhelmingly the casualties of this economic transformation, as a basket of deplorables. It was a social sneer, and it may have lost her the election because it spelled out what during the previous 2 generations had been merely implicit. As Western societies became ever more prosperous in the decades after 1945, actual socialism was an ever harder idea to sell electorally. In the 1960s, the British Labour Party gave up on campaigning against poverty, there being ever fewer genuinely poor people to form a base of support, and invented the concept of relative poverty. It was a stroke of genius, they must have thought, aimed at guaranteeing them eternal life, because if poverty can be reduced to almost zero, at least in rich countries, relative poverty will be with us always. Right? In the 1970s, parties of the left across Western Europe and North America improved even upon this. They forged rainbow alliances of feminists, gays, ethnic minorities, immigrants, anti-nuclear protesters and others in an attempt, often successful, to forge electoral majorities.
I want to call this group of people the people with privilege poverty.
Well, that's what it's become, certainly. Maybe in some cases, even back in the 1970s, it was, although I'd be very reluctant to concede that immigrants and, say, black Americans were in any sense privileged in the 1970s. But it can certainly become that in the longer term, yeah.
I know you were talking about how, like, you said that this tactic didn't really work, but I kind of think back to the Obama era, and we had 2 terms of Obama, but I believe he was the only person who was actually able to do this. He actually was able to put together that coalition and garner enough votes from a bunch of different, like, disparate minority groups. And I think that was something that Biden and Harris had tried to continue to do, but weren't able to do it as well as Obama did.
Right. I mean, I think probably Bill Clinton did that to an extent as well. Certainly, he didn't campaign on big state at all because he was getting elected just off the back of the Thatcher and Reagan period and the death of communism, and everybody knew at that point that this just isn't going to work. So he did play to the rainbow stuff at least somewhat, yeah. But yeah, you're right. Mainly that's Obama. But in the process, those parties increasingly left their original constituencies, the native working class, behind. Now, with deindustrialization in the late 20th century and the outsourcing to Asia of much industry that remained, that strategy must have seemed vindicated for a while. The trouble is, the industry may have gone, but those who either were or would have been its workers remained with votes. And by the early decades of this century, those people knew that the Democrats, the Labour Party, the SDP, etc., were nothing to do with them anymore. The new economy had left them high and dry, either jobless or eking out a precarious living serving burgers on minimum wage. And all the parties of the establishment left, now populated mostly by college-educated types with politically correct opinions, did was vilify that old constituency and everything they wanted and thought and valued. By now, the Democrats are the precise opposite of their own self-perception. They're not the champions of the poor. They're the party of the affluent, a statement borne out by surveys of voters. And they have Hollywood and the entertainment industries, the major retail chains, the mainstream media and advertising, the school system and government bureaucracy on their side. As one young voter interviewed just a day or so ago put it, the Democratic Party seems very focused on a lot of issues that seem to be for upper class. And then he ran off a string of identity topics. The new dispossessed have responded by turning hard right. The election of Donald Trump in 2016, like his re-election now, was the revenge of the basket of deplorables. The Brexit vote of earlier that same year was a British equivalent. The reasons for voting to leave the EU have been listed and debated endlessly, and it is no part of this talk to enter into arguments that have been gone over thousands of times in the pretense of offering superior wisdom. But at the core of it was an angry repudiation by the British working class of the Brussels technocrats and their high-flown schemes, and of the British political elite of all parties that supported them. That repudiation was emphatically restated 3 years later when Boris Johnson won his landslide by breaking down Labour's red wall in the 2019 general election. And the same sentiment is also why Nigel Farage's Reform Party picked up the same voters this past July when they promptly abandoned the Tory party, which had reverted to being led by technocrats. In continental Europe, the precise configurations differ from country to country, but the overall pattern is the same everywhere. The indigenous working class, unemployed or underemployed, socially disenfranchised, and vilified by all the organs of polite society, forms the bedrock of the far-right resurgence. It may focus its fury on the sacred cows of the establishment like DEI and identity politics, but it's also nihilistic in its wish to tear down the civic architecture. It wants not a more level playing field or changed rules, but to change the game. And here's my central point on this side of the discussion. No amount of disdain, whether from the establishment left or from the old establishment of the GOP, think Mitt Romney, or the Tories, think Rishi Sunak, is going to make that constituency go away or see reason. The new, poor, angry right may be voting for fools and lunatics, but they do so precisely to express their anger at an establishment, left and right, that refuses to address their issues. Bill Maher, not exactly my or anybody's go-to source for serious political philosophy, seems to have got it exactly right when trying to explain why anyone at all would vote for such obviously unhinged types as Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert. He suggested that it was a statement by the nouveau poor to the elite. This is how much we hate you. The solutions, in quotation marks, that the insurgents demand may be illusory. It cannot, for example, stop all immigration into countries with way below replacement birth rates without running out of workers and thereby, amidst much else, condemning the protesters themselves to a hungry, unnursed old age. you can, if you please, slap massive levies on Chinese imports in order to bring back manufacturing jobs, but then you can kiss goodbye to all the cheap tat on sale in Walmart, the stuff that makes life in the trailer park endurable. Above all, you can't undo the digital revolution and its calamitous consequences for traditional employment. Now, merely because the problems are likely intractable, though, doesn't mean that they cannot at least be addressed and ameliorated. The fact that they're not addressed is because to do so will be to slaughter too many sacred cows of the technocratic elite, whether of the old GOP, Tory, CDU establishment, or of the multi-culti and bisexual types who now lead the parties of the left. Throwing social scorn, deplorables, and vilification, uneducated, is easier. So they do that. And so the problem continues to fester. In 4 years, Trump's career will be over, if he lasts even that long, along with his vice-like grip on the GOP. But the basket of deplorables that has been his empowering anger base is not going anywhere anytime soon. It'll still be here in 2028, and indeed in a generation from now.
Yeah, and something that I think is so interesting about Trump's campaign, especially the first time around, that I feel like he really tried to make this point that he was the candidate for the common man. But what's crazy to me is that the man himself, has more money than any of us will ever see in our lifetimes. And yet somehow he was able to convince everybody that this was true.
Right. I mean, it is an unusual phenomenon, and in a way, this discussion isn't going to, quote, go there. But what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, just look at the slight British parallel, right? Boris Johnson won over, the people of Sunderland and Hartlepool or what have you, who would never normally have dreamed, or at least in previous years, wouldn't have dreamed of voting Tory in a million years. And who is he? Well, he's, Eton and Oxbridge educated, but he's a bit of a Jack the Lad. And of course, that's exactly what we've got, rather worse than that, actually, in the case of Trump. So yes, but you're quite right.
And I think too, and maybe Brian, you want to say more about this, that we've been talking about recently, though, I think his re-election this time around, he really pulled more people in than just the everyday man, right? Like, the economy here has been much worse than it was than when he was president. And so I think a lot of people who suffered from that are now voted for him just on the basis of the economy alone, that they want him to rectify. And I mean, it is true in some sense that he is a businessman. I don't know if that's why, he was able to sort of help the economy, but that's
a number of times, yeah.
Right.
No, and I think too, because he was able to garner so much of the vote. It's not just the Republican Party that voted for him. I'm looking at the numbers, and to me it looks like 5% kind of came over, and to me these are Democrats. These are classic liberals who are just tired of an open border, tired of fentanyl just crawling into our country, and tired of an unstable economy, and where there's a trash can on fire every other week. And I think it's kind of a return to normalcy for a lot of people. Now, those 5%, I doubt that they'll ever tell their friends that they voted for Trump, but they secretly did, and you can see it in the numbers.
Right. I mean, one of the remarkable things is that he actually won the popular vote, and he's the first Republican to do that since 2004 with the second George Bush election. And before that, I think it was his father back in 1988.
Seniors.
So Republicans have not won the popular vote ever since 1988, except for those two occasions. And the second of those was a couple of days ago, yeah. Okay, well, let's look at the other side of this equation now. Having made one load of people angry, let's annoy the others, because this is fun. Okay, so we're calling this section, on the other hand, the snowflakes, quote, that just won't melt away. Now, when jdvance was named Trump's pick for vice president this summer, his jibe from several years ago about childless cat ladies was dug up and recycled against him endlessly. Had the Trump campaign failed, at least some accusatory fingers would have been jabbed toward this remark. A Harris victory would have been the revenge of the childless cat ladies. And yet, however tasteless it might be to point the fact out, childless cat ladies certainly exist by the many millions in America and in all Western countries today. Yeah, I can insist that, like the basket of deplorables, they are a real phenomenon. But that's because, unlike Vance and Clinton, I'm not running for public office. If you are courting the electorate, though, it's best not to insult them. Even if you've abandoned all hopes of gleaning the votes of your chosen targets, they all have friends and neighbours who are more biddable. So, where did all those childless cat ladies come from? They are one of the many byproducts of that epiphenomenon, the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And here I want to point to Mary Eberstadt's wonderful book, Primal Screams, The Sexual Revolution and the Origins of Identity Politics, which does an absolutely wonderful job on this subject. Now, that revolution, based as it was to no small degree on the invention of the contraceptive pill, normalized sexual promiscuity. The ability of women to reject sexual advantages was thereby gravely weakened once the obvious danger of pregnancy was largely taken away. Looked at in that light, far from empowering women, the pill arguably disempowered them. Within a decade, sexual experience among high schoolers became general. Living together before or outside of marriage rose sharply, and divorce rates soared across the West. Single motherhood also mushroomed, for no contraception but no is entirely reliable, and that in turn greatly increased the pressure for the legalization of abortion. Indeed, the collapse in social pressure on men to be committed and stay committed was the main fuel in the new wave of feminism during the 1970s and 1980s. Women rightly demanded access to the same educational and career opportunities as men, and on the same terms. For if a man can abandon you, perhaps leaving you with children, then you'd better be empowered to fend for yourself, and state benefits had better make provision for people like you. Now, by the late 1980s, these battles had largely been won, but the social devastation from the ongoing sexual freedoms was and remains immense. By now, a very large minority's experience of growing up is of fragmented families, domestic chaos, physical or sexual abuse, and an inability to trust any relationship because they're all, rather like Trump's politics, transactional. Above all, boys and girls alike have no experience of an adult male role model. Indeed, the adult males that too many have experienced have been unreliable or inadequate at best, and objects of fear at worst. And the effect of these experiences has been vast. But its principal outcome has been the strong alienation and mutual mistrust between men and women. Perhaps we should just step aside here for a moment to mention the big gender gap in the vote in the presidential election. It was not actually as big as it was expected to be. That was part of Harris's downfall, but nevertheless, it was very marked. And it's a consequence of this new social chaos. Without solid fathers, young men haven't been properly socialized. Thuggishness in habits and demeanor and failure in education, these have become the norm now. The pitiful state of home life endured by many children, the sexual pressure placed on girls by schoolmates, and the powerfully feminist tone of most school teaching all reinforce the perception that being a man is a bad thing. For many, identifying with alternative sexualities or retreating from sex altogether, even in adult life, is a way of coping emotionally with the relational chaos. For at least some boys, becoming a woman is one way of escaping the guilt that comes with being male. And it has the bonus of paying out wider society. For at least some girls, becoming a man is one way of making oneself immune from sexual aggression, of asserting strength. And if those around you get upset, well, serve them right. To say that the personalities shaped by all this domestic chaos are fragile would be a woeful understatement. Even without factoring in the turbocharging effects of social media, the rising generation has by far the worst mental health of any generation in history. Coel, I tended to make a point of saying this to most of my freshman classes when I was teaching in college. I don't know if I did that during your year, or if it's one of the 99.9% of things I ever said in class that you've since forgotten.
About mental health?
Yes, that you. Yeah, I would say something like, you are the most mentally fragile generation that has ever existed in history.
I don't remember you saying that, but I'm sure that we got that impression from you just by you stomping about the room. So
Oh, that's a low blow even by your standards. Okay,
well,
I
sorry
tend to
if it
say
hurt.
this kind of thing and follow it up with some, for once, me being pastoral and caring and things like that.
Right.
Not
Yes.
sure why I bothered really, but there we are. Okay, but in that circumstance, the least criticism, even inadvertently, a microaggression, is experienced as a challenge to one's very being. There's no room for disagreement, for there's no longer any objectivity. It follows that to question my choices is to invalidate me. And the result, as we're all aware, is the phenomenon of woke, angry assertion of chosen identities, often chosen precisely for their provocative or performative effect, and the insistence that anything less than full respect of them is oppression and deserving of punishment.
Would you say that this is the same as, like, I've heard people throw the word around like tribalism?
Well, it's I mean, there have been many forms of tribalism through history, but this is a kind of, it's like a neo-tribalism. Yeah. Although I would suggest that in many cases, the membership of the tribe is not permanent,
Mm-hmm.
even if many of the angry and distraught young people like to tell themselves that it isn't. That it is. It isn't. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's no room for discussion. There's no room for, like you said, like being able to hash things out and talk about it. It's all more call for violence and a call to arms because you're because especially with what you said about microaggressions, it's like if I say something but then that you know angers someone to the point where it's like they think that I'm attacking them with my words. It's like we're also supposed to have a conversation about whatever the topic is.
Yes, exactly so. Well, millions of young women in particular have internalized the reality that men are not to be relied upon. Those who've been sexually abused or just used as minors have been scarred for life, mostly through internalized self-hatred, to be sure, but often in scars made visible by the women themselves in the form of fashionable self-disfigurements. Marks that scream, "I don't care," at the world, whilst actually caring very, very much. Oh, and anger. Lots of inchoate anger at the world in general and at men in particular. And here's my central point about this side of the equation. Huge numbers of women, and of men too, don't even want a partner or children or to settle down at all, having endured all that chaos growing up or witnessed it. They prefer safety. The plummeting birth rates of the West are driven not by most women preferring one child rather than two or three, but by the 35% or 40% who are having none at all. Studies show that looking only at those women who become mothers, birth rates are about the same now, 2.3 or 2.4 per woman, as they were 50 years ago. The birth dearth is the result of the soaring numbers of women who, by choice or by circumstance, never have children at all.
I think even for the rest of us who haven't endured some horrible childhood abuse, I think there's also the feminist promise of having a fulfilling career that prevents women from settling down or even just settling at all.
Yes. Well, there's a multitude of factors, and I'm just jabbing my finger at what I think is the most important of the driving forces, but there's a whole load of other things that are going on here as well. Yes. Yes. I've already rather queasily confessed to my occasional doubts about the wisdom of the poor and too desperate having the vote. So another such damaging admission cannot make my reputation any worse now. It's this. I perpetually hear Pericles' words from the funeral oration ringing in my ears. For a man's counsel cannot have equal weight or worth when he alone has no children to risk in the general danger. For our own safety, I know, right? Not a very saleable proposition today, but pre-modern people could see it. For our own safety, we should want anyone with a serious voice in public affairs to have not rights, but an actual stake in our common future. The sexual chaos, the atomized families, the left's vice-like grip on schooling, these are the roots of what we've come over the past decade to call wokery. In a mirror image of what happens on the other side of the political divide, the standard response of the anti-woke is to resort to mockery. The young are snowflakes. They are absurdly precious about themselves. Their claims are preposterous, and so on. Well, yes, they are. No society is sustainable that seriously sought to actualize these demands. But just as with the disenfranchised workers or non workers in the Rust Belt fueling the Trumpian insurgency, the pain of the young is all too real. And in the case of the woke, their chosen identities are also, at some level, experienced as real, even if they seem to the rest of us to be preposterous. Whether they can even be reasoned out of it is somewhat doubtful. Certainly, they will not be mocked out of it, and least of all by grumpy old white men.
And we don't know any of those.
No, no, you don't. Okay, so to conclude this, and so here we are, stuck. The left shows no sign of learning from its defeats.
Mm-hmm.
Ever since the 19th century, leftist bourgeois ideologues have greeted with bewilderment and incomprehension the unwillingness of the actual people to support their self-styled benefactors.
I completely agree with you because after seeing some of the reactions from the media after this election, it's the same old, where it's like they just continue to bash anyone who voted for Trump. They're all stupid. They don't know what they're doing. They're racist. They're this, they're that, and it's just going back to the basket of deplorables. And it's like they just keep doubling down on the same like thoughts of like, well, they're just a bunch of idiots. They're all stupid.
But I do think that this kind of discourse has been built up amongst, let us call it for the sake of argument, grassroots leftists now, that those people can't stop talking that way. They really think that they've somehow plugged into reality. And if this is going to change, it's going to have to come from the top, from people saying, we're going to lose most elections like this. This is not getting anywhere. We are persuading absolutely nobody. All we're doing is letting off steam and making ourselves feel better. Right? In 2020, Joe Biden, confronted with a Trump-leaning black man, expostulated, if you don't vote for me, you ain't even black. I doubt the line between that racist, or at least patronizing gaffe, and Trump's improved showing among young black men will be a very straight line, but a connecting line there will be. As I listened to the results come in on election night, a mid-ranking Democrat official was being interviewed and asked why so many millions of working-class people had voted for Trump. And she did exactly what you would predict, Brian. She paused, She listed all of the usual and indeed perfectly correct charge sheet against the orange one, and then concluded lamely that all these people were voting against their own interests for reasons she could not fathom. Well, she's had almost a decade to think about it, and she admits on air that she has no clue. But the incomprehension cuts both ways, for the right is not learning anything either. The woke are not going away. You can't reason people out of what they were never reasoned into in the first place. And anyway, the right isn't even trying to reason. It just mocks and vilifies. It's more consoling, I guess, to do that than to recognise that they're woke because for half a century their elders have lived like alley cats and turned domesticity into a frightening hellscape. The digital revolution and the sexual revolution. The former can't be undone, and the latter could be undone only by a counter-revolution which, however desirable it might be, looks wildly improbable. So what does that leave? Learning to live with one another would be a start. Not going all out to provoke one another would come a close second. Allowing others to live and speak as they see fit without attempting to corral them into probably federal or state mechanisms like schools that push for politicised outcomes. Not trying to rescue the children of perfectly decent parents who dare not to say your shibboleths. Drawing back from winner-takes-all politics. Now, it will by now come as not too much of a shock to most people listening that I am here arguing for actual conservatism. This is a stance that has little enough in common with the largely now defunct neoconservatism of 2 decades ago, and nothing at all in common with a pugilistic thuggery that has since overtaken the American and European right. So what is it? Being not an ideology, but an opposition to all ideologies, conservatism is not easily summarised, but the points that concern us here are simple enough. It prioritises stability, both social and political, and favours the mechanisms that make for it. And it insists upon a high degree of self-restraint and mutual forbearance, even in respect of those things or people that we feel entirely unable to respect. The neoconservatives, by contrast, wanted worldwide revolutions that would turn Iraq and Afghanistan into Belgium. It has to be said that they didn't, despite all their expenditure of blood and treasure, come very close. And the angry new right will delegitimise the media and the counters of votes. It'll storm the Capitol and fight in the streets if it doesn't get what it wants. Both incarnations, then, are to be rejected precisely on conservative grounds. A friend of mine on the left, appalled at Trump's re-election, has posted, "Seems like the arc of justice just did a U-turn." And I was a bad man. I commented, that will be because there isn't one, an arc of justice. Enlightenment optimism was wrong. Justice is what the eschaton is for. There is no arc of history. The quest for perfect justice or a perfect system is not merely a chimera, it is actually dangerous. It's a guarantee of endless social conflict and the loss of any attempt to live a civilized life. Government exists to impose relative justice, least worst outcomes. And real conservatives, more than anyone, recognise that public life is about optimisation, trade-offs between ugly choices, and an attempt to ensure that as many people as possible have a stake in ongoing stability rather than in instability. Just as with immigration, or the drug epidemic, or the proliferation of gun crime, there is no short-term fix. But no progress can be made in any direction without some kind of long-term goal in view. And that long-term goal needs to be relearning the first requirement of a civilized life. Simply how to live together.
Yeah, I think deep sigh as you just wait for the thunder to roll in.
Well, the thunder was that there was no thunder, right? I realised that conclusion for some people could sound really lame because everybody's so charged up with some ideology or other, which they want to see vindicated, and that's totally unreal. That is our problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Going back to what you were saying in the beginning about democracy, though, doesn't that make democracy then the best fit for what you're talking about? Because everybody is, given equal priority and they are allowed to vote. And as far as we've seen in the world around us, democracy does seem like the closest to this ideal.
Right. I only pretend to be a dinosaur most of the time. But I would say it is not what we have taught ourselves that it is, the default position of human society. Right? The default position is something very different. Right? We are a historical peculiarity, and long may it continue. Right? But it was attained only with the greatest of difficulty over a long period of time, and it will only be sustained the same way. And we do nothing to sustain it. All our mechanisms undermine it. Certainly, there's a democratic deficit going on now. For years, particularly after the collapse of communism, the number of democracies in the world was growing and growing. For the last, I think it's at least 15 years now, it has been declining. And even in states that remain democratic, there's a democratic deficit in the sense that there's kind of backsliding, right? I mean, in the case of America, the most pronounced thing is the kicking aside of lots of restraints and checks and balances, the need for majorities of 60 in the Senate to make various decisions. That's been overturned for somebody's momentary advantage, not thinking that a few years up the road, the boot's going to be on the other foot. This is a bad thing to do. In other countries, it's other things. It's kind of constraining the judiciary and this sort of stuff. Yeah.
Well, Brian, anything you want to add to Mike's conclusion that we all just need to be nice and get along?
No, like you said, that's not what people want to hear, but I mean, it's the truth. I mean, that's what we need is stability. I think it's good to recognize that it's stability that we want, and that sometimes there's two hard decisions to make, and you're making the least bad decision. And there's never a utopia. Over the last 4 8 years, we've seen a lot of ideologies and ideologues, and people who think that if society was just like this, it would be perfect then, and that's just not a reality. You see it on the right, you see it on the left, but what it comes down to is making really hard decisions and then being able to live with one another to create a stable society and move forward.
Right. I mean, one of the things I suppose that's made me mad, even though I don't live in America now, I'm sure most Americans must be a lot more mad about it than I am, but just merely observing it from a distance now. But the way a number of senior Democrat politicians talk about that they're bewailing the polarization of society and how we need to dial this all down. That's all obviously true. The trouble is that nobody believes it, simply because the Democrats don't have a truly nasty figure at the helm like Trump. And they have people up there who can smile in public, doesn't mean that people's ordinary experience at the grassroots isn't one of polarization, that there are kind of politically correct people trying to make their children like this or like that, or deny you a job unless you can show that you think this, right? So the only way to stop the polarization is to stop the polarization by actually modeling it. It's not just a case of having a leader at the front who knows how to smile.
Yeah. Right.
Hopefully we've outraged everybody and nobody will ever watch it again.
Right. Well, and I, for one, am happy to know what your thoughts are on the election. I like this conclusion that you've come to, and that everybody can equally be offended. I always appreciate that about you.
Yeah, well, that was what I tried to model in class, really. What did we call it? Equal opportunities abuse. And I
Yes,
think that's
yes.
a thoroughly good thing. Okay, well, I guess we will see you at the next of our regular podcasts, which will be a new series coming up soon. So thank you, everybody, and see you again shortly. Bye now.